Okay, so here we have our curved seam line. And now I'm just going to show you, we take our small scissors and we're going to clip into this like this, just up to the seam line. You want to be really careful that you don't actually cut through the stitching, but you cut as close to it as you can. That's why these scissors that I mentioned earlier are actually very, very useful, because the tips are very sharp. So you can get right in there and cut right up to the edge. So there, that seam now can be pulled in the other direction and it will open up so that all the seam allowance will spread apart. So now when you turn this right side out, and you wouldn't do that until you have the whole thing completed, but just to show you, this will curve and create the neckline for the dress form.
So this example is a concave curve because the inside is smaller than the outside. If we were to just try to turn this neckline facing to the inside, the seam allowance would be shorter and we wind up with a puckery edge. So the way to get around this is to just clip right up to the seam line, as I've done here, and that way when you turn the facing to the inside, the seam allowance can actually spread to be the same width as the garment, and that gives you a nice smooth edge. And now that I've pressed the facing to the inside, you can see that the clipping gives it this beautiful smooth curve. This next example is a convex curve where the outside is longer than the inside. This is a collar piece, and so if I were to turn it to the right side here, you can see that the seam allowance inside is buckling up. And if I were to press this just so, it wouldn't be a very smooth curve, and you'd probably have little ridges in your fabric from the folds in the seam allowance. Convex curves are also pretty easy to clip. Instead of making little slits though, you just cut out little notches because you need to make the seam allowance a little bit smaller. So yeah, go ahead and cut out little notches. Just be sure not to cut through your stitching line. And then when you turn it right side out, you can see that the seam allowance isn't laying on top of itself anymore. It's actually just lying nice and flat because you removed the extra material. And now that I've pressed this collar piece, you can see that the clipping helped make this outer edge be really smooth and not lumpy.